In 1950, Guatemala became the first country in the entirety of the Americas to experience a communist-influenced government. This marked a significant event in the nation's history. By 1954, the country had already witnessed a major change in leadership, as President Jacobo Árbenz was accused of attempting to transform Guatemala into a Soviet stronghold. U.S. media outlets claimed that President Árbenz had betrayed his country and, as a result, was forced to be overthrown. The U.S. government, working closely with exile Carlos Castillo Armas, participated in a coup d'état in order to save the Western Hemisphere from what they perceived as communism. As per the narrative, the U.S. government and exile leader, Carlos Castillo Armas, were primarily focused on protecting the profits of an American fruit company. It is, however, crucial to note that this didn't solely center around the prevention of communism or the protection of the democratic ideals in the region. Rather, it was a tactical move driven by the desire to safeguard the commercial interests of an American fruit company. Throughout the following 40 years, Guatemala experienced a brutal dictatorship and unparalleled levels of genocide. This was the consequences of a political and economic decision made much earlier, which didn't only transform the country, but also its citizens. The Cold War was intensifying, as China had adopted communism, paralleling the Soviet Union's move towards U.S. nuclear weapons. Paranoia spread across the United States, amidst the suspicion of Soviet agents infiltrating all aspects of society, including officials, reporters, and even actors outside of the U.S. However, a brave change was taking root in Guatemala. A man named Jacobo Árbenz was promising real, far-reaching change for the people of Guatemala. For what seemed like decades, the United Fruit Company, a major based in Boston, stood in control of the country. With controlling influence over economic resources, the company maintained a nearly monopolistic market through bribery and corruption. As a result, life was dire for the majority of Guatemalans. 80% of the population lived in poverty, with 70% unable to even read or write. The average life expectancy fluctuated between 35 and 50 years, and most individuals could only hope for a brief span of healthy living. The situation was dire, and change was necessary. Árbenz, with nothing but his vision for change, sought to elevate the living standards of Guatemalans. He believed that a government reform would be vital to improving conditions for the population. This led him to take control of the neighboring country, El Salvador, in order to create a model for economic and political changes in Guatemala. This inspired many Guatemalans to join him in his mission of providing a better future for their nation. In conclusion, the Cold War era was marked by heightened tensions and heightened paranoia as suspicions of Soviet agents permeated all aspects of American society. Yet, at the same time, a brave, far-reaching change was taking place in a small, yet significant neighboring country, Guatemala, led by Jacobo Árbenz. This change embodied a genuine desire for improvements, bringing hope and aspiration to an oppressive and poverty-stricken society. General Manuel Arturo Quevedo Arosamena, who was in charge of the military command in Central America, strongly supported the idea of redistributing the unused land from big landowners to the poor farmers. He considered it as a fundamental step towards alleviating poverty amongst the Guatemalan society. Given this context, it was not surprising that his biggest target was none other than the well-known company, United Fruit. When General Arosamena decided to confiscate the idle land of the United Fruit Corporation, he promptly offered a sum of $1.2 million in compensation. Based on the exact data that the company had provided to the authorities, it is important to mention here that, according to the company's own tax filings, they were expecting a hefty sum of $16 million as a compensation. However, General Arosamena refused to accept this proposition, which would set him back against one of the most powerful men in Washington. As a result, the headlines in the major American newspapers, such as the New York Times, Time, and the Washington Post started emerging, warning of a rapid and drastic descent of Guatemala into communism. These journalists, who were primarily sent in by United Fruit, were eager to propagate the very same narrative that their corporate sponsors were pushing. Consequently, the very concept of national unity and social harmony was put to the test, as the Guatemalan government found itself embroiled in a heated debate on issues of great global importance. The CIA gave the plan a name, Operation Pubsux. On paper, it was simple: remove Árbenz without bloodshed if possible. In reality, it was anything but bloodless. The man chosen to lead the coup was Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan exile. He was backed by dictators in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic, who supplied weapons, money, and men. The CIA trained his fighters in Honduras, armed them with rifles and explosives, and even considered assassination plans. One CIA requested silencers for rifles. Another memo mentioned liquidation of personnel. Kill list was drawn up with the names of government officials, union leaders, and suspected leftists. But the real weapon wasn't guns, it was fear. The CIA unleashed a wave of psychological warfare. Death threats appeared on doorsteps. Coffins and hangman's nooses were delivered to politicians. Fake radio broadcasts reported uprisings and defections that didn't exist. Newspapers were flooded with stories of a collapsing government. To the outside world, it looked like Guatemala was crumbling from within. By June 1954, Armas and fewer than 200 men crossed into Guatemala. Militarily, they were weak, but propaganda had done its job. Generals refused to answer Árbenz's calls. Army units stayed in their barracks. Even the Air Force, his strongest card, wouldn't fight. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Árbenz resigned. He called out the United States for destroying his country and insisted he was no communist. But by morning, he was gone seeking asylum in the Mexican embassy. 10 days later, Carlos Castillo Armas was installed as Guatemala's new leader. He had come to power through an illegal coup backed by foreign money and foreign guns. Yet Washington wasted no time. The US immediately recognized his government, sent aid, and praised the fall of communism. But Guatemalans soon saw the truth. Armas reversed almost every reform. Over 1.5 million acres of land were returned to United Fruit and the wealthy elite. More than 500 unions were outlawed. Workers who had briefly tasted hope were forced back into silence. And then came the violence. Suspected Árbenz supporters were hunted down. More than 9,000 people were arrested in the first weeks. Death squads emerged and marked vans patrolled the streets, picking up anyone accused of being leftist. Bodies, often mutilated and burned, were dumped in public squares as warnings. Fear became the government's most powerful tool. The dream of democracy was gone. Guatemala was now firmly under the control of a US-backed dictatorship. For Armas, loyalty to Washington mattered more than loyalty to his people. For the United States, the mission was accomplished. United Fruit was safe. But the course was only beginning. With every kidnapping, every execution, every silenced voice, Guatemala slid further into darkness. What started as a fight against communism had created a nightmare, and that nightmare would last for decades.
The coup of 1954 didn't just remove a president. It set off a chain of violence that would scar Guatemala for generations. For the next 40 years, the country lived under military regimes backed by the United States. In the cities, fear ruled daily life. Unmarked cars prowled the streets, abducting students, union leaders, and suspected dissidents. Many never returned. Death squads carried out public killings, leaving bodies as warnings. In the countryside, the government waged brutal campaigns against entire villages accused of harboring rebels. By the time the Civil War ended in 1996, over 200,000 Guatemalans were dead, most of them civilians. Entire communities were erased, and through it all, Washington continued its support. Money, weapons, and training flowed south, all justified as part of the global fight against communism. But for ordinary Guatemalans, it wasn't about communism. It was about survival. Families lived in constant fear. Generations grew up knowing nothing but war. It wasn't until 1999 long after the Cold War ended, that President Bill Clinton admitted U.S. support for Guatemala's violent regimes was wrong. But words were all the victims received. No compensation, no justice, no true apology. The story of Guatemala isn't just about one coup. It's about how a superpower put corporate profits and Cold War, paranoia above human lives. A democracy was crushed, and hundreds of thousands paid the price. And even today, the shadow of 1954 still hangs over Guatemala,